Have you ever stood in the middle of nowhere and just feel like the place is watching you back? Like sure, your GPS says that you're here, but the ground feels older than maybe it should, weirder, wiser. And it's not just a feeling. Sometimes it's a sound, like wind caught in mesquite, or the click of your boots on gravel that used to be a shell midden. Or it's a pattern you barely notice at first. A clearing that's just too level. A line of stones that look suspiciously intentional. A tree with bark stripped in one careful spiral. And then you see it. A rusty fence line that leads nowhere. A concrete survey monument jammed into caliche like a flag planted on the moon. Or maybe a soybean field where a village used to be. Flattened. Buried. Renamed. I'm Lindsay, and this is Stratified, an archaeology podcast, where we peel back the layers of history, bureaucracy, and of the dirt itself, to get at the stories we were never meant to forget. Last time we got a surface-level introduction into cultural resource management and what it's like to do archaeology in a system that doesn't always know what to do with archaeology. But this time, we're digging into land. Who draws the lines? Who moves them? Who disappears when those maps get redrawn? So grab your water bottle, crack open a dusty map, and let's talk about how land gets taken, and how archaeology can either reinforce those stories or help challenge them. So, like with a lot of history, let's start with a lie. The lie of empty land. Early colonial maps in North America were more than just functional tools. They were stories about possibility, about so-called wilderness, about conquest, about the land that just needed a good settler and a strong plow. And if you've ever looked at an 18th century map of Texas or Oklahoma, or any place really, you'll notice who's missing. It's not just that Indigenous nations weren't labeled, it's that they were erased entirely. In a lot of these documents, land was described in the negative, unsettled, unclaimed, unused, as if not building a stone chimney meant you didn't exist. And even today, those narratives linger. We still hear things like, no one was really out there, or it's just ranch land. And the language used, it wasn't just descriptive. It was strategic. Words like vacant, wild, undeveloped. They weren't neutral. They erased Indigenous presence and justified settler claims. A forest became timber. A prairie became potential farmland. A river became navigable infrastructure. The shift in vocabulary was a shift in ownership. If you rename the land, you also get to rename who belongs there. Archaeology, weirdly, sometimes plays along. We rely on site files and old maps to decide where to dig. But what about the stories passed down? The trails remembered? The names that never made it into county deed books? There's this saying I love, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And nowhere is that more true than on a site that's been farmed, fenced, and forgotten for 100 years or more. So let's retire the idea of empty, because it's never just empty, unclaimed land. The whole concept of the wilderness was a PR stunt. The wilderness doesn't exist. Not the way we think of it anyway. The idea of untouched, pure, uninhabited land. That's a colonial construct. A carefully curated myth used to justify displacement, conquest, and control. It starts with a simple equation. If the land is wild, then the people on it are savages. And if the people are savages, well, the land needs saving. Cue the cavalry, cue the fences, cue the forced removals. But here's the truth. What's now known as North America wasn't just some blank canvas waiting to be painted. It was a living, breathing, managed landscape. People across the continent shaped their environments with intention. Through fire ecology, seasonal harvesting, controlled burns, terracing, fishing weirs, seed exchanges, orchard maintenance. Land use was science, culture, and ceremony, all rolled into one. Even the animals we think of as wild weren't just there. Their patterns were influenced by human interaction. Bison migrated in part because indigenous communities guided their movement, sometimes with fire, sometimes with built corridors. Acorn groves weren't just accidents, they were cultivated. So were berry patches, fishing holes, hunting routes. This wasn't wilderness. This was home. But the settler imagination needed a frontier, so it invented one. And when manifest destiny started running out of space to manifest into, the government shifted gears. If we can't settle the land, we'll preserve it. Enter the national park system. Places like Yellowstone, Glacier, and Yosemite weren't empty lands waiting to be discovered. They were actively inhabited, stewarded, and cherished by the people already living there, until the U.S. government decided they made better postcards than homelands. Yellowstone was home to the Crow, Shoshone, and Bannock. Yosemite belonged to the Ahwahnechee. Glacier National Park, Blackfeet territory. And when these parks were created, the indigenous people were removed. Not always through war, sometimes through paperwork. Treaties broken, relocations forced, access denied. Meanwhile, the story became one of conservation, a noble mission to protect pristine lands from, ironically, the people who had lived there for thousands of years without destroying them. There's this concept in ecology called shifting baseline syndrome, where every generation assumes the world they grew up in is the natural norm. But if your baseline starts after the erasure, after the burn bans, after the buffalo were slaughtered, after the people were removed, then your idea of wilderness is already skewed. And that skew shows up today in how we do archaeology, in how agencies and museums categorize cultural versus natural landscapes, in how public lands are managed, even in how we talk about stewardship as if it's something new. So when someone says, this land is untouched, ask, untouched by who? Because the myth of wilderness wasn't about protecting nature. It was always about taking land and writing people out of their stories, their histories. Let's pause for a quick story that ties all of this together. This is the segment I'm calling Fresh Digs. Again, working title. It focuses on a current news story about archaeology, culture, ecology, or just something I find interesting. So in California, indigenous fire crews are bringing back cultural burning, also known as good fire. Now, these aren't wildfires. They're carefully managed, low-intensity burns practiced for generations by tribes like the Karuk. The kind that promote native plants, dissuade invasive species, prevent catastrophic fire events, and restore balance and nutrients to the land. For decades, cultural burning was outlawed, called arson. But now the tide is shifting. California is starting to recognize the value of traditional ecological knowledge, and indigenous fire practitioners are reclaiming their places as land stewards. One fire crew member said it best: fire is medicine. It feeds us. It protects us. It's not dangerous unless it's been taken away for too long. It's a reminder that land management isn't some new idea. It's an old one, sometimes as old as the land itself. Okay, let's move from myth to math. Let's talk about how you carve up a continent. In most of the US, that system is called the Public Land Survey System, the PLSS. It was a grid, a beautifully brutal, bureaucratic grid, 1 mile by 1 mile squares, 36 sections in every township, numbers instead of names, land turned into spreadsheet cells. Texas is a little different. We love being different. We mostly miss the PLSS because of Spanish land grants, impresario contracts, and a whole lot of messy frontier deal-making. But the result was still the same. Land parceled up, owned, sold, controlled. And then came fences. Barbed wire changed everything. It was the death of open range. Suddenly, land didn't just belong to someone, it excluded someone else. Fence lines showed up on maps, but they also showed up on the ground, in the way animals moved, in where people could walk and couldn't walk, in who got to call something theirs. One time, I was working in South Texas, and our team kept bumping into a fence line that cut through the middle of a historic site. On one side, a family cemetery with sandstone markers. On the other, a rancher's caliche road and some longhorns. We talked to the landowner. He told us, that's always been empty land. I was standing 6 feet, both vertically and horizontally, from someone's great-grandmother on supposed empty land. And here's where archaeology gets weirdly poetic. Because even though we work in grids, transects, shovel test pits every 100 meters, neat UTM coordinates, we're not always finding things that fit in that system. Sometimes, most of the time, the land pushes back, a scatter that crosses the boundary, a site that sits on the edge of a creek that's moved since the last time anyone's mapped it. Sometimes the truth doesn't care about your grid, and that's when you realize the map isn't the territory, the fence isn't the history, and the survey form, it's just one more page in a greater story. Let's talk about water, or more specifically, what happens when people try to control it. Throughout the 20th century, agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers launched massive flood control projects across the U.S. They built dams, rerouted rivers, tamed the flow of water in ways that made the land more manageable. But here's the thing. When you control a river, you often erase a history. Whole communities were displaced, especially Black, Indigenous, and Mexican-American towns in Texas and beyond. Some were moved with formal notice, others were just flooded out. Take Lake Livingston, for example. There are oral histories from families who lived there before it was a lake, who talk about homesteads lost underwater, cemeteries, churches, places that had names and stories long before they were submerged. Sometimes we hear those stories. Sometimes we find them. When drought drops the water level just enough to reveal a brick pier foundation, a wooden post, a scatter of ceramics no one expected to see ever again. One time we were doing salvage work along a reservoir edge and found a half-buried cast iron stove, still upright, still intact. It was resting on what used to be someone's kitchen floor. There was no site file, no marker, no mention in maps or official records. And this is where archaeology steps in. Not always ahead of the damage, but sometimes just in time. We show up when the lake recedes, when construction cuts a little too deep, when erosion pulls back the layers. And in those moments, we get glimpses of what was lost. Not just structures, but stories, memory, evidence of a life lived and then drowned out. Flood control might be about safety, about management, but it's also about power. And archaeology can help us see who paid the price. And while we're on the subject of controlling water, we can't not talk about Louisiana, or more specifically, New Orleans. Let's also talk about treaties, because the management of water, who gets it, who controls it, and who gets left out, has always been political. And for Indigenous nations, it's been a hell of a fight. There are over 30 federally recognized tribal nations in the U.S. with legally binding water rights based on treaties. But enforcing those rights? That's a different story. In places like the Klamath Basin or along the Colorado River, tribes are still battling for access to water they've been promised for generations. And in some cases, water that's essential not just for drinking or agriculture, but for ceremony, for salmon, for survival. And here's a twist that you might not expect. There were also beaver treaties. In the 19th century, U.S. and Canadian officials signed agreements specifically focused on fur trade regulations with Native nations. These weren't conservative agreements, not exactly, but they show that people were paying attention to beaver populations and Indigenous people were managing those populations long before that paper trail showed up. Today, some tribes are bringing beavers back, intentionally, as part of wetland restoration and climate resilience. Beaver dams hold water, slow erosion, create habitat. They're land back in action. Cute climate strategy with paws and teeth. The Mississippi River once flooded on its own terms. It built land, fed marshes, moved sediment like a sculptor shaping clay. And communities living there, like the Chitimacha and the Homa, worked within that system. They built dwellings that could move, lived on higher ground, knew when to shift with the river. Then came levees, dams, canals, the total engineering of a wild waterway. It turned out to be a dangerous gamble. The more we tried to confine the river, the more power it gained. And when Katrina hit, it wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a failure of infrastructure, of planning, of hubris. And a lot of the people affected were the ones who had the least amount of say in how that water was managed. Sound familiar? But here's something a little more hopeful. When beavers were reintroduced into parts of Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, wetlands started bouncing back. Slower water, more filtration, natural fire breaks. That's right, beavers, the unlicensed hydrologists of the mammal world, were doing what multi-million-dollar projects couldn't or wouldn't do. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it is. Indigenous knowledge systems had already accounted for all of this. Water control, fire, seasonal shifts, all of it. So when we talk about archaeology and flood control, it's not just about looking back. It's about paying attention, not just to what was lost, but to what was already working. Before we wrap up, I want to come back to the idea of being pushed off the map, literally, because it's not just that stories get erased, it's that people do too. Take Texas's Lost Cemetery Project. It's a statewide effort by the Texas Historical Commission to locate and document burial grounds that have been forgotten, paved over, ignored, intentionally erased, especially cemeteries tied to Black and Indigenous communities. And these aren't isolated incidents. They're systemic, and they're still happening. Right now, the Lipan Apache are fighting to protect a sacred burial ground directly threatened by the construction of the U.S.-Mexico border wall. In 2023, a federal report came out and confirmed what many already knew. Tribal, cultural, and burial sites were blasted and desecrated during the wall's rushed construction, often without proper consultation or consent. Cemetery del Barrio de los Lipanes in Presidio, Texas, is one of these sites, an 18th century cemetery that faced erosion and neglect for decades. Now, once again, endangered by policy decisions that view land as blank space. We're not talking about the distant past. We're talking about bulldozers hitting cemeteries today. So, now that we've traced how land gets taken, through maps, fences, dams, even language, what do we, as archaeologists, do with that? What can we do? And more importantly, what are we sometimes afraid to do? Because let's be honest, archaeology has a history of playing it safe, of staying inside the box, of filling out the form without asking who wrote the questions. But if we're going to tell the truth about land, about whose it was, what happened to it, and who's still fighting for it, we need to step outside the grid. Sometimes that means listening harder. When someone says, "My uncle remembers a village here," we shouldn't just go looking for the map. We should go looking for the uncle. Sometimes it means adding something to the report that we know might get cut out, writing it anyway. Sometimes it's as small as saying a site's important, even if it's just a scatter, because we know what that scatter represents. And yeah, sometimes it's saying no. No, this site's not gone just because it's been plowed. No, we're not going to call that burial disturbed just because it doesn't look like it should in a textbook. We don't always get to stop the bulldozers, but we can slow them down. We can put a flag in the ground and say, hey, this matters. Because archaeology, for better or worse, is storytelling. And stories shape what people think is worth protecting. So if we want to tell better stories, truer stories that include the people who were pushed off the map, we have to be brave enough to change the script. And if that makes the review process a little messier, well, good. Thanks for listening to Stratified. This episode covered a lot, or at least I tried to cover a lot. Maps, myths, fences, floods, treaties, beavers. If it sparked something in you, I hope you'll share it with a friend, a colleague, a landowner, a local official who still thinks no one was really out there. You can follow the show on Instagram and Blue Sky at Stratified Pod. And I would love to hear your stories. You can email me about archaeology, ecology, or just about anything at stratifiedpod@gmail.com. If you want to share one of your stories, let me know. I'd love to hear it. And you can find transcripts, source links, and bonus material, one day when I have bonus material, in the show notes. Until then, may your profile stay crisp, your batteries hold more than 10%, and your shovel test surprise you with just enough weirdness to keep things interesting. Whether it's a gum wrapper or a groundstone. Flag it, log it, and let's keep digging.